Cheryl Twomey, who's just been so wonderful, just constantly sending me personal notes and messages and let me know when things are on fire or not on fire. Just one of the very best friends of the show and feel like a friend even though I haven't met her yet. She had a question that was number 2 in rank, but I put it first because I thought it was so good. And the question is, to me, freedom is freedom-loving thinkers. Oh my gosh. Okay, I tried to get this. Printed, but it clipped the sides. We're having problems with that printer, so I'll just read it off the screen here. Cheryl's question is, to me, freedom is being able to have a TSL in the first place, a group of freedom-loving thinkers who do question our government without fear of reprisals. No questions today. I won't be watching since I'm still on vacation, but I'll be here in spirit. Happy Independence Day, Strata Loungers. I'll catch you on the upswing. It's a shame you couldn't be here for this, Cheryl, because it's such a great question. Excuse me. I've been corresponding with a friend of mine in Russia. She's a photographer, extremely talented, unbelievably talented photographer who does really romantic. They look like pictures of the Grand Duchesses. They're just so soft and they're so old world. They're just really talented person. And she said to me a couple occasions, you're just really brave. And I generally lost. It's like, but I haven't had a chance to even show off yet. No, she said, you be careful. You're criticizing your government and you're taking on some big people, and you're also, not being shy about how you feel about Islam when Islam decides to go into blood mode. And I have to tell you, I was really surprised by that. I was really quite surprised to hear her say that she thought that took real courage, physical courage, because I've never felt that it did. And that's why I like your question so much. And I think that's something we really should be remembering on this Independence Day, probably first and foremost, is that, we get to do shows like this, little shows, big shows. We get to live in a society where, despite how bad things have gotten, people like me and you and everybody who comments on the show and leaves comments anywhere, members, all of you, even if you just watch it, we still live in a country where you can say whatever you damn well want to about these charlatans, traitors, incompetents, weenies, and felons, and get away with it. It's astonishing, and I really needed to hear that from my friend in Russia, because it's not like that over there. It's so much better now than it used to be, but the history of the Tsar, which caused the revolution, the brutality of the Tsarist regimes caused the revolution. But what the Tsar was doing in the Tsar's prisons and the Tsar's punishments, the Bolsheviks made him look like Club Med. The Bolsheviks made his prisons look like Club Med. What the Bolsheviks did for 40 years, something like that, more than that, 50, 60, 70 years, is just do nothing but murder people. And I've said this before, but it bears repeating. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, with the Cheka, and then later the OGPU, and then the became the KGB, and before that they were the somebody else I've forgotten. Those people didn't just murder. They didn't murder criminals. A criminal element, a person who was a murderer or a thief or something, would go to one of the camps, go to one of the gulags. And even though they were a criminal, they were not an enemy of the people. And one of the things that the Soviets figured out real early was that and it's true, I think, in some of the German camps too, we figured out that, the Soviets figured out that, hey, if we send the criminals to the camps along with the political prisoners, then the criminals will be the enforcers, because they're brutal and violent and they've got nothing to lose. And that's exactly what happened. The prisoners feared the criminals inside their cages with them more than they feared the guards. So I bring all this up only to say that it's hard for us to imagine what that does to you. And I don't mean just does to you in terms of people that lived under it. It does something to people whose parents lived under it. And I am actually really beginning to believe quite strongly that it's almost the inverse of the genetic selection that went on in the United States. I know that's, you can't really say things like that, but I don't think there's really any question about it. They have found a gene that codes for risk-taking, among other things. And NSVD, thank you, Patrick. And KVD. Anyway, there apparently is a gene that codes for risk-taking. And that means that I bet if you sampled the U.S. population and the Russian population, I think you would find an enormous difference in that particular gene. In fact, I think what you'd find is the world norm would be somewhere down here. The U.S. population would have it much higher. Certainly 50 years ago, they had it just an enormously higher percentage of people carrying that gene. And I'll bet in Russia it's a lot lower. And it's for the same reason. If you're tired of tyranny and you're 1 in 1,000 who wants to walk away from their little village and get on a boat, go to sail someplace they've never even seen before, let alone heard of or have a job, no, just going to get on a boat and go. We're going to give up everything. We'll probably never see our family again. We're going to go. So if all those risk takers come over here, you tend to leave the population with fewer risk takers, which at this point would be the world mean. But in the case of the Russians, where anybody who spoke up, anybody with any initiative, the loyal citizens, they're doing it for the Soviet state, just somebody who stood up against the party, not even stood up against the party, made suggestions, that kind of thing. Nope, free thinkers, they were taken out and shot. So not only did we select for this risk-taking gene, which I think leads to freedom, and all of the fear that freedom brings to people in terms of having to take care of yourself. So we not only have a great deal more of it, I would say, but in Russia it was stamped out, it was just killed. And what they did is still so horrifying to me, and more horrifying than what they did to the Jews in Germany in a way, because it was just, they were killing people statistically. They were using probability theory to kill people, even though they didn't really completely understand it in terms of the mathematics. They're very clear on the idea. So what they would do is, it wasn't like they just put dissidents in camps, and it wasn't like they just put people who'd either said anything against the state, or forget saboteurs and wreckers and all that stuff, but people who they didn't even put people who had committed simple crimes like criticizing the regime in prisons or shoot them in the head. What they did was they took people who were likely in the future, more likely in the future, to do those kind of things, and they shot them too, or put them out in the gulags, which is pretty much a death sentence anyway. So just think about that. You may be, it's not like a maybe thing. It's probably the biggest heartbreak of the Soviet Union, and there's enough there to go around, was the idea that so many of these Russian soldiers had endured so much. It really stopped Hitler pretty much, I won't say they did it by themselves, but in terms of hand-to-hand combat kind of thing, mostly by themselves. And you saw millions, 7, 8, 9 million Russian soldiers killed, and huge numbers taken prisoner, especially at the beginning of the war. These people fought for their country against the fact that whatever the Bolsheviks had done to them through collectivization, and every one of them had relatives, probably had been taken out and shot, or knew people whose villages were destroyed by the Bolsheviks. But they had such patriotism that these soldiers would go out there and perform these miracles of bravery in Stalingrad and outside Moscow and Leningrad, all of this. And I think the greatest tragedy of the Soviet Union is that the people who went out to the front and were the most patriotic, who fought hardest for the Rodina, for the country, would almost always, virtually every time, no matter how heroic they were, virtually every one of them that had been taken prisoners were either shot or sent to the camps, which again is pretty much a death sentence. And you may wonder why that is. Well, they've already shown that they're heroes. They're not people who surrendered. They're not people that just walked across enemy lines. Some of these guys are, seen by an entire platoon or an entire company of people, took out a German machine gun nest by himself. They're war heroes. They put them into camps because they'd seen the West. They put them into these gulags because they had seen the West. And if they'd seen the West, then that was a real problem for the Soviets. So, what do you say about that? If you had relatives, when the Tsar has one of his pogroms, one of his anti-Jewish campaigns during the time before the communists, and he starts murdering Jews everywhere, and Jews who can afford to get out of the country are forced out of the country because the Russian government was murdering them, and they go to Paris or they go to Brussels, or they come to the United States, or anything else. Just they chased them out of the country. Well, when the Bolsheviks came along, if you had relatives who were in any of these countries, you were probably going to go to a camp or get shot, because you were more likely at some point to commit a thought crime in the future. You might, in the future, be more likely to criticize Joseph Stalin or the 5-year plan or whatever. I always go into this kind of detail because we just don't appreciate it. It's like the reason I showed some of those videos on the Orlando firewall. Some of them are very graphic. They were by far not the most graphic things that I saw. I had to really tone them down, but people just don't see it. They just forget it because they don't come in contact with it. They don't appreciate it. But when you've had everybody who had any initiative just killed, you're gonna have some residue and some serious cultural echoes of that. And one of them was my friend genuinely saying, I'm really worried about you because you're criticizing the government. Back to Cheryl's point, I said, I'm not the slightest bit worried. I mean, being a somewhat public figure, which is, stretching the term public figure, but it does put you at a little bit more risk. I think there's probably no question about that. But I don't worry about this at all. And as far as the Muslims go, I don't worry about them too much either. In fact, never really enters my mind. So that is a function of how much and how pervasive this freedom has been in the country, that we all can do this without a moment's hesitation, And by the way, if the worst excesses of the U.S. government would be that progressives had weaponized the Internal Revenue Service and given especially tough scrutiny to conservative 501c3s, that is a disgrace, and it's got to stop. But that's a long way from getting shot in the back of the head. So anyway, it's a great question, and I think it's always a great question to start our little Independence Day video off on. And the idea is obviously that you can write questions like that. We can put up these pictures of Obama. We can criticize him. We can say this guy's an idiot, whatever, and we don't have to worry about it. It's not just nice. It's not just cool. It's an absolute, honest-to-God miracle. Maybe the greatest miracle in the history of the world. That's why we have to fight to conserve it, my friends. That's why we have to fight to conserve it. So